Hi folks, my name is Jo. Today I've made it like a quick video about reflection and critiques. And the goal of this is to actually convince you that it's something that you could use with your team in your project work in order to come up with different ideas and better results. One myth I did want to bust early was that there is no such thing as too early to give feedback. That in fact, if you plan your feedback and if you have some rules around it, then you can do it as early as you want to, even after you've just had your initial idea. So reflection and feedback are integral and definitely connected. Reflection in itself is a very important tool that designers use. And in fact, the creative process is quite reflexive. And so there is a connection between the intellectual part of making things and the ongoing critique of what you're making. And so one way to describe it is the thinking hand. So while you're molding a piece of clay or making a model or drawing a sketch, you're adapting how you're drawing it or making it as you go along. And that's reflection in practice. There are different types of reflection, and I guess the easiest way that they've been kind of broken down is there's before, during, and after something happens. And so before something's happening, then it's called reflection for action, where you're preparing, you're making your mind up, you're making decisions, you maybe even making assumptions. There's reflection afterwards as well, so you can have reflection on action, so where you're kind of analyzing what just happened there and what does that mean for me and my project and how is that going to go down. And then I guess the one where design really calls on is that reflection in action. So while you're doing something, you're really thinking quite intently, like, is this feeling right? Is this working the way it should? What's working well and what could be improved? So you're kind of constantly quite critical of what you're making and how it's all fitting together. And I guess John Dewey, so the man behind Learning by Doing, says it really quite well, where we don't really learn from our experience, we learn from reflecting on that experience. And so taking the time to think about where you're at and think about what you've done is actually what's going to improve what you're working on. And that applies to everything from things you're designing to just day-to-day life. One thing to be mindful of when reflecting and giving feedback is how the brain actually works. And so there was actually one bit of study by Rick Hansen, which really looked at the neuroscience of happiness and how that applies to feedback as well. And so the way they described it was that the mind is like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. And so you might find that when you're giving or receiving feedback is that you remember all the negative things people say, but forget all the positive ones about your design or your approach. So something to be mindful of when you're giving feedback is that you might have a note taker or somebody who helps you capture all the feedback, good and bad, so that afterwards you've got a really good guide about what actually happened. During reflections, critiques, presentations, it's also really mindful that it could be like an anxious or a bit stressful time, and there are different ways that you might experience that in your body. So anything from kind of feeling a little bit lightheaded or dry-mouthed or a little bit worried, fidgety, all those things can really happen when you are a bit upset. And so I guess for all of your team to look out for some of these signs when you are presenting work, because if somebody's feeling overwhelmed, then the best thing you can do is call a time out or give yourself a bit of a break so that you know, nobody gets hurt, and they can accept the feedback that you're giving them. At the moment, I'm going to share a little bit about how we kind of give feedback and receive feedback in design studios. But the motto really is share early and share often. So creating a rhythm of sharing feedback and sharing your ideas really helps kind of get new ideas out in the open and expands your thinking when you're working in a team. This is kind of what a critique session looks like, or a design crit for short. It's kind of a structured, semi-forced reflection and a discussion on what you could do to improve something. And so you kind of pin up all of your work, how it is, unfinished, semi-finished, and you kind of go around with your fellow designers or teammates in order to kind of explore the things that you're worried about, the things you'd like to improve, and gather feedback about parts that you might even think are really great. Sometimes in design studios, these kind of critique sessions can be blocked into your week. So it might happen that, you know, every Wednesday at lunchtime you might have a critique session, or Friday afternoon you might have another one. And so the real goal of it is to kind of create a rhythm so that people kind of get into the mind frame that they're always going to be sharing work, and it's not a big deal and it's not terrifyingly scary. And because it is kind of a casual session where you're pinning up what you have, then there's not as much pressure as creating a giant presentation and trying to impress everyone with how complete your thinking is. So why are critiques valuable? Well, there are kind of 4 things that are really great about them. One is they unblock you. So often you might be stuck on an idea, or you might need to think in a different way. Actually sharing your idea with your broader team will help you kind of discover new ways of looking at things, and it might unblock your thinking or unblock even where the project might be stuck. It increases quality, and I think everything, all types of design, all types of ideas usually get improved by looking at other people's examples that might be better, being inspired by those, but also getting great feedback from others about what could be improved. The great thing about these sorts of critiques, especially in a design studio, is it encourages consistency, because you're seeing how other people are doing things and solving the same problem in a different space, and you can kind of leverage that same thinking, or you can you know, try that in your space as well, in order to kind of make sure that, you know, all the services or all the policies and products are consistent. And the final one is you can really share kind of context, and I guess the beauty of that is by regularly critiquing, you know, what you're working on, your team, and even, you know, more broadly, a larger team or whole organization can actually know what you're working on and see the connections between the different projects, or themes between where different projects might even be struggling or need some extra help. Here's a few tips on how to prepare for a critique. Step 1 is really to remember to set some context. So you do really want to set up what you're working on and what you'd like feedback on. And that's, you know, the hardest part really. So one example might be, I'm working on the details of this gender equity policy for casual staff, and I've been looking at some examples, and this one in particular, so maybe you share an example, is really interesting, and I'd like, you know, I'm curious, or I'd like to know about what you think of the language here. And that way you get really quite detailed response, and quite thoughtful response from people who are looking at it. So this is probably the best case scenario for a response when you've given no context. So you just share a screen grab and you go, what do you think of this? Often people don't know what they're looking at. And they might actually tell you it's good or neat or okay, because they don't want to disappoint you, and they don't know what type of response you're looking for. Worst case scenario without context is they won't like it, or they won't understand what it is, or what the purpose of it is. And the tricky thing of this type of feedback, because it isn't specific or what you're actually looking to elicit, is you might not know how to apply this feedback. It's just not enough information for you to change your design. So it's really important that you share the goals and concerns you have for the piece of work you're trying to get feedback on. So it's important to my team that our policy is accessible to everyone, especially migrant staff and people who are time poor. I need any advice about creating a clear structure and using visuals in policy. So at that point, you're even asking your feedback partners or teammates to actually give you examples of things that might work better, or ideas that they might have on where to look for better ideas or options. It's also really important to continue asking questions during your critiques. So asking the people you're presenting to, what's working in my design? What needs more attention? And making sure that you follow up any feedback with why, or why is that? So if you get a response of, I really like that, and the best thing to do is ask why do you like it? Keeping it casual and light can give you some really great insight into what people think is important, and how they interpret your design. So for some really simple things, when you are kind of hosting a critique, there are two really easy ways to describe the method around who speaks and when. So one is called round the room, where you really do go one by one and everybody presents their idea. And you can ask people around the room in a certain order about what feedback they have for you. The second is a bit more organic. It's a free-form discussion, and so we kind of call it popcorn. So when somebody's ready to give you feedback, they'll pop and they'll tell you. So the round the room one is probably takes a bit more time, and depending on how many people you have, it can take quite long. And popcorn is like really kind of, a casual way to get feedback from the people who really feel passionate or have something to share. So I guess the challenge for you, if you are in the audience of a critique session, is to also hand over to people who haven't really spoken up yet. So if you are a person who's maybe a bit more confident or has been speaking a bit, please try to hand it over to other people who might not have a chance to say anything. So that's my challenge to you as an audience member. So after you get some feedback, reflecting on it is really critical. So thinking about things like what just happened and what did they tell me and how did I respond? And most importantly, I guess it's really about how can I change my design based on that feedback? So a hot tip, if you are starting out critiques, is to have a teammate write notes for you during the critique, so that you have a copy for later. And that's just really great because that can show you progress with your ideas as you move along with your project as well. And again, it's quite useful because you might not remember all of the feedback if you've been getting a bit of negative stuff, and positive things just float away. So you can also learn more. Here are a few quick videos on YouTube about both reflection, critiques, and how to run them. So feel free to explore those in a bit more detail.